I really didn't want to watch this show, but since everyone is giving their 2 cents about it, I thought I might as well just do the same. So I watched the 2 episodes of Amazon Prime's The Rings of Power, and I am not calling it The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. So instead of this video being part a reaction and then the other part is the review, it's going to be an overall review of the elements of the show from the story to the acting to visual effects and other things like that. And then I'll use clips of the reaction to kind of highlight certain discrepancies about it. And even though I haven't seen episodes 3 to 6 yet, I guess based on what has been said about them, I don't really think I need to. And as we get toward the end of the video, there's going to be a few things we need to cover. There's one thing specifically that I find very suspicious, and as far as I know, no one else has spotted this yet. So, since we've established a preliminary of what to expect, let's get to it.
The Rings of Power. I'm Bane, and we're watching The Rings of Power.
So, the first thing to look at is the story of the show. I've seen the first 2 episodes, and I still don't know what the show is about. And I think there's plenty of other people who feel the same way. But essentially, there's multiple stories going on at the same time, I guess. I guess on a basic premise, the show takes place, I think, several hundreds, thousands of years, maybe after the period of the Silmarillion, and then it's kind of a middle period right before The Hobbit. I think I could be wrong. One story is about sort of a reimagined take on the character of Galadriel, and that she hunts down Sauron after taking up her brother's mantle after he died in battle. And at some point, she becomes destined to join the other elves into the Undying Lands. And why that is, I have no clue. So the next story surrounds an early descendants of hobbits that are known as Harfoots. They are sort of depicted as being like a peasant woodland civilization. If I'm not mistaken, that might be more of a creative embellishment on the showrunner's part, given the fact that they're like a blip in Tolkien's anthology.
I'm an old habit.
And then at some point, one of the Harfoots, the younger female Harfoot, finds some old man in a meteorite, which might be Gandalf. I have no idea, to be honest. And then you have another instance where you have elves that are scouting out regions of Middle Earth, I think.
Do you think me blind? Do you think me blind? Or any chance do you think me blind? 'Cause my name is Michael Caine.
To protect certain areas that might come under attack by Sauron's forces. I think. I don't know.
Now, of course, it's the Don Lemon Elf Warrior. Just out of curiosity, is it that one actor from Hot Fuzz that says like,
Right.
no, I guess not.
And so far, that's pretty much all I know. So the next thing would be the acting.
You gotta be freaking kidding me. Really? What devilry is this? Actually, it's probably more like this. What devilry is this?
It's almost as if every example of character portrayal in almost every scene seems lifeless and unmotivated. It's almost like, and you see this with almost everyone. It's almost like it's some kind of force that just seems to permeate through everyone.
And the acting is just like pointless. There's like no real motivation at all.
I am grateful you have not known evil.
I think this is it. Is this the line?
But you have not seen what I have seen.
I have seen my share.
You have not seen what I have seen. Evil does not sleep, Elrond.
You have bits of dialogue in this thing that barely make any sense. And I would say they're even kind of desperately written to kind of sound sophisticated or philosophical. But you know what? I take that back. You do have bits of dialogue in this that are just so profound, and they're so moving. Like this one, for example.
The same wind that seeks to blow out a fire may also cause it to spread.
What does that mean?
And then you also have this.
The dog may bark at the moon, but you cannot bring it down. Take your leave.
Eh? What is that supposed to mean?
And who could possibly ever forget about this?
Do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot? Because the stone sees only downward, but the ship has a secret. For unlike the stone, her gaze is not downward but up.
You see what I mean? Now, the next would be the visual effects. You know, I would say that some of it was pretty good, like the opening battle sequence in the first episode, but then there are other times where the overuse of CGI and green screen are just so obvious. It's like those environments don't really seem to blend well with everything else, and it becomes somewhat unconvincing. Now, the next would be the score of the show, and, you know, I did think it sounded very similar to Howard Shore's score that he had done for Peter Jackson's adaptation. In some ways, I kind of considered it a carbon copy of Howard Shore's score that he had done. Now, I didn't know this at first, but just to be sure, I went on to IMDb to look up the crew information, and he actually did compose the original theme. And overall, I did think that it seemed all right. I think there were other times it really didn't sync well with certain scenes, like there's the one scene toward the end where, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, where the one town that thinks that more orcs are coming evacuates, and you know the music gets very dramatic as they all kind of travel out. I don't know why, but it just didn't really seem to sync well with that scene, and there are some other scenes that are like that as well. So the next thing would be the set design and scenery. I think for what practical set design and scenery there was, you know, it did look pretty good. I think the only slight criticism I have is with the one scene with Elrond and Galadriel in, I think it was Rivendell, if I'm not mistaken, where you kind of have some of the foliage in that area seem to be too overgrown on like pillars and like statues and monuments. You know, and you can consider that they probably did that as sort of like an extra aesthetic, but it still seemed a bit much, especially for how those places are depicted in the original films. And then the last thing to mention would be the armor and other costumes. You know, some of the costumes seemed a little odd and kind of out of place if you were to reference Peter Jackson's adaptation. For example, the armor that the elves wear seems not only too ornate, but it also seems too flimsy to be practical in battle. Not to mention the fact that it also looks like it's made out of wood, what seems like an unnecessary use of the earthy or sort of woodland aesthetic just because they're elves. Even the armor of the dwarves seems kind of, well, I'll let this clip explain.
What the heck is up with those helmets? It's like an iron face mask that's like casted with a beard. Is that consistent? I don't think so.
So now that we covered all that, let's look at the problem with the intention of the show. So to start off, one of the reasons why the show has no heart, let alone any life to it, is because Tolkien's fantasy world has been hijacked and turned into a platform of socio-political propaganda that not only dismantles the constructs of Middle-earth, but is also designed to intentionally dishonor his legacy. There are feminist overtones that are obvious given the fact that most of the men on the show are portrayed as being weak and overly passive, while female characters like Galadriel and the one woman who slayed that one orc from attacking her son are portrayed as being stronger and more valiant than most of the men, as they easily slay monsters and lash out and bark orders at people around them. We've already seen this with members of the Tolkien Society as they've replaced the meaning and nature of Tolkien's work with leftist political thought. And it's no surprise we're seeing the same thing with this, given the fact that any major criticism of the show is met with backlash by the cast and by the producers, by deriding people who are fans of Lord of the Rings and slandering them as being racist, just to avoid the reality of the show's failure. And also by asserting bizarre notions about gender that are out of context and antithetical to the nature of Tolkien's world. They also attack and misrepresent Tolkien's religious views. which were a major source of inspiration for his works by claiming that they were originally rooted in racist and ideological extremism, which is just absurd. Now, personally, I don't adhere to Roman Catholicism, but as a Christian, and even for the sake of addressing this at its face value, I just thought this issue was too important not to mention. So at this point, we've already covered some of the reasons why the show is terrible. But before we get to the final review, there's one more thing we need to cover that might be at play as an underlying aspect to the show being a disaster. When we consider the change that was made to the character of Galadriel, as she's depicted as being a warrior on a relentless quest to defeat Sauron, and as she asserts her will against anyone, especially overtly passive men, that would dare to question her motives. But it's only at the scene where she jumps off the ship, traveling to the Undying Lands, is when this hidden aspect is slightly revealed. It's right before she decides not to proceed with the rest of the elves. She remembers when she was younger, telling her brother that, what did she say? Something about the lights in the sky reflecting more brightly in the water, and then something about which to follow, or something like that. To which he says,
Sometimes we cannot know until we have touched the darkness.
at first, I thought this was just another example of contrived, idiotic dialogue, which it is in a way. But thinking back to it and watching how she reacted after being rescued, I was starting to notice a pattern here. Because once she was rescued by a group of people who were adrift after being shipwrecked,
I mean, I guess every show's got to have its deranged elderly mental patient character, right?
her behavior became more erratic, not only by acting aggressive and bitter to one of the people who actually helped rescue her, but later on in episode 3, from what I've heard, she condescends and insults foreign dignitaries, threatens the lives of authorities. She even proclaims she's willing to repay someone by spilling blood. And I guess in episode 4, when she confronts the Queen of Numenor, she talks about something concerning a tempest or whatever, to which she shouts, "There's a tempest in me!" And the only time she ever expresses any sense of happiness, or a lighter side, is when she experiences freedom when horseback riding. I guess. This just isn't how she's described in Tolkien's works. If there's any evidence of her being rebellious or showing her dark side, there's the one account in Tolkien's History of Middle-earth in which she was disobedient toward the Valar, and the moment of her temptation from Frodo's offering of the One Ring in the Fellowship of the Ring. Commentary by Christopher Tolkien, as referenced by ValarGuild.com, states that the authorized version can thus be summarized. As one of the leaders of the Rebellion of the Noldor, Galadriel falls under the ban of the Valar, not obeying the Valar by not returning to Valinor at the end of the First and Second Age. Galadriel shows pride, and she still seeks dominions of her own, and thus the ban stays in place. It has even been suggested that having been a leader of the Exodus of the Noldor, the grace of the Valar was withheld from her. Only by passing the test, refusing Frodo's offer of the ring, she is finally pardoned and allowed into Valinor.
I passed the test. I will diminish and go into the west.
In that moment where her temptation is driven by a desire to reign with malice and to be worshipped, she still denies the opportunity, defeating the evil desires within her. So back in the show, this motivation for her to jump ship as a way of signifying that she's taking control of her life and forming her own path by the wisdom of her brother, and then acting cynical and spiteful to display her power, symbolically represents her relying on the inner strength of the darkness within herself. Now that sounds very similar to the method of psychoanalysis developed by Carl Jung. Based on the concept of the personal shadow or the unconscious shadow, is a psychological method of tapping into the dark side of one's psyche that is usually suppressed from being outwardly expressed, and then integrating aspects of that darkness as a means of better controlling it, and resulting in empowering the individual to live out their full potential. Now that would make more sense if the character was actually written for that reason, but in order to connect that concept to how we see her in the Rings of Power, we actually have to take a closer examination at what inspired the formulation for Jung's method, which just happens to be alchemy. In a nutshell, the basic idea of alchemy stems from various early examples of chemistry that proclaimed of changing primitive forms of matter into material of higher and lasting quality, specifically changing basic metals such as lead into something more refined like gold or silver. And that concept would later develop into a spiritual philosophy for transforming oneself into a higher state of being that's likened to a godlike quality. Just to give an example, in order to get to the refined form of that material, the object would go through a stage of deliberate destruction or darkening in order to remove any extra ingredients that are unnecessary to its condition, and then it would go through more refining until its completion at the final stage. So for Galadriel to touch the darkness is meant as a phase of being self-destructive or volatile from her original state for the sake of transformation into something else and to find the true light or the true meaning of life for herself as she finds her own path. And this is the reason why she becomes so reckless and vindictive later on, which really comes across as being pretty ineffective since she was basically unlikable to begin with. Recently, The Hollywood Reporter conducted an interview with the actress playing Galadriel as she discussed the development the character will undergo in further episodes. In this recent interview, actress Morfydd Clark discussed how humility will play a big part in Galadriel's evolution. Right. So the article goes on to say how Galadriel herself is already centuries years old in the series, but she's still young in her evolution and hasn't yet quite found the serenity, or notably how to learn to rein in her temper. Well, that's interesting. The actress would go on to say how she particularly relished showcasing Galadriel's surprising arrogance while standing in front of royalty as the only elf in Numenor, which Tolkien's Galadriel would never do. She even describes herself as a fan who has seen the original Lord of the Rings films tens and tens of times. Yeah. And while she hasn't spoken with Cate Blanchett about the role, she did say she drew upon her portrayal in the films to help build the evolution of her character from a feisty fighter to a wise ruler. And while she spent close to 2 years shooting the first season alongside a large cast in New Zealand, she says she doesn't know all the details of her character's development, but knows the general arc. She stated that humility is going to play a big part of her arc. I'd say learning the limits of herself. She'd even go on to say how the elves have a sense of arrogance to them because they are in some ways superior, but ultimately they have to gain some perspective. Now, all this talk about learning humility as being part of her evolution is potentially nothing more than hot air that's not going to result in anything like that. But you do wonder if the use of the word humility actually has some secret tie to alchemy as well. Well, many alchemists believe that there should be some kind of divine reverence when engaging in this process of transformation, that there should be a sense of humility to the approach. One alchemist states that alchemy requires an intense personal humility. The alchemist sees everything they encounter as sacred. The esoteric science/art of alchemy is referenced as divine chemistry. Another example would be an emblematic illustration that is attributed to the 17th century mystic Heinrich Kunrath that describes it as an alchemist on his knees as a sign of humility and obedience toward the divine force to help him engage in the work of alchemy. Along with this reference to humility as being part of the needed attitude for this divine work, it's also part of the phrasing that alchemists use meant to imply this stage of alchemical change. The alchemist's body and soul is removed of every vestige and dissolution, bringing him to a state of ultimate humility in his awakening, bringing him to a state of darkness and to self-destruction as a form of renewal in his newfound journey. And the famous mystic and Freemason Manly Palmer Hall emphasizes this by quoting what he considers to be the alchemist's prayer from his book, The Secret Teaching of All Ages, which can be summarized as meaning, being plunged into darkness as a way of being recreated into humble matter for the final work. As interesting as it is to consider what's taking place in the series, shouldn't there be a reason that characters being framed like this in light of the feminist agenda of the show? There are celebrities who are advocates of the feminist movement who find empowerment for their cause through mysticism or some form of New Age philosophy. But there is substantial evidence to show how occult teaching has been an integral part of the feminist movement even from its early beginnings, a phenomenon that's been well documented by scholar Per Foxneld in his latest book published through Oxford University. So it's possible that the change in her character or attitude is due to an alchemical, if not maybe a generally mystical philosophy that's operating as a meta-narrative that's either in alignment with or under the guise of political feminism. Now, I know that seems like a bit of a stretch to assume that that's the case, but that's the whole point of the esoteric. You know, those associated with it will drop out like a hint of an idea, and then the rest of the message will be hidden to people who are unaware of it. Those who intentionally inject the concept into a story to form another narrative will never be upfront and explicit about it. But since they're in the know, they can see it play out as the story unfolds. Plus, this explanation makes more sense given the different examples of mysticism that have either been subtly woven into or been blatantly presented as the main component of the plot of various films and television shows over the years. So if there's any brave souls out there that continue to watch this show to see how bad it gets, and if it goes in this direction, I'd really appreciate if someone would let me know. So now that we've gone through all those details, let's do a quick tally of the problems. Number 1, the poor production quality. Number 2, the fact that this thing is just a hub for a political agenda. Number 3 would be the removal of the original religious inspiration. And then 4, you've got a possible occult meta-narrative that's either part of or at least riding the coattails of the show's politics in order to replace the original religious background. And they can't even get that right. You know, I could score this show maybe somewhere out of 10 or out of 5, but instead I'll summarize it in 5 words. I would say soulless, pointless, boring, atrocious, rip-off. And that's all I have to say.
Anybody finds out that we helped a stranger, and anything bad that happens the next 3 seasons will be our fault. Happens the next 3 seasons.